Welcome again, everyone, to TNS Radio Ireland. You're listening to Mike Montagne, original 1968 architect of mathematically perfected economy, speaking on mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. Original material, analyses, and solution, as always, are copyright and trademarked by yours truly. All rights and therefore claims of authority are reserved. Archives of this program can be downloaded freely from perfectedeconomy.org/FTP. Copies can be distributed freely only so long as the entirety of this program, including this copyright and trademark notice, remain intact. Much thanks to the band Q-Ree of Chicago, Illinois for Patty Ryan's Despair. Find their music at qree.com. That's spelled C-U-ROI. Good to have you with us again. I've got Ivan Belostenko again from TNS with me. Had a couple things I'd like to get out of the way really quickly. I've heard a lot from many people about the debate between the Lawful Bank and myself, and thanks for the very positive and encouraging emails and whatnot. But I think it's necessary to make it clear that we hardly started to mop up all the issues there. Originally, the persons promoting that bank were claiming that the creation of money belongs in the hands of government, that it can't belong in the hands of a private bank. Now, of course, they're advocating a private bank, so there's, beyond the inconsistency there, is another matter. And that is that in truth, the people are the real issuers of money. Why is that? It's because money is created on our promissory obligations. That is, when we sign a contract to purportedly assume a debt from a banking system. In fact, all they're doing is publishing further representations of our promissory obligations. But that's when the money is created. It's created and it's given value by our commitment to deliver to the overall pool of wealth whatever we've agreed to. Now, of course, this is misrepresented by the banking system, but the banking system is not the issuer of money, nor are they the rightful, nor are they creditors, because they never give up property commensurable to the debts that they only falsify. But likewise, they're in no way should we have private entities deciding what the criteria are or whether or not we have met them. The enforcement of whatever principles we decide upon, which at a minimum, if we're going to have just economy, those principles are the principles of mathematically perfected economy, because this eradication of exploitation and obligatory schedule of payment are the only thing that maintain a circulation in which the remaining circulation is equal to the remaining value of represented property and remaining obligation to pay just that much for the remaining value of represented property. Only the currency of mathematically perfected economy is immutable by this perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship. Now, a private bank or entity has no business deciding whether or not those principles should apply. That's the authority of the people under any representative or democratic government. Likewise, no private entity would want to do this, since we're doing it without profit. So why create all these banks? And you have to understand that this bank that we were just debating the other day is just one of many banks. There are just unbelievable numbers of people proposing alternate currencies and banks. Now, a further thing that we have to understand is that none of these alternate currencies save our problems, even if you did mathematically perfected economy as an alternate currency. The existing obfuscated currencies of the world would continue to multiply falsified indebtedness upon us until we suffer the present terminal failure. Do these alternate currencies, even alleviate any of the need to borrow money back into circulation of the kind that was originally issued so that we can maintain a vital circulation to service this escalating sum of debt? No, it's not alleviated at all. And in fact, many of these alternate currencies already exist. Many of the first of them asked me for their blessing because they based them on my work, thinking that they were going to solve something. I explained that they wouldn't. They've done it anywhere. So we have proven models now that none of these currencies are solving the problems. Have they reduced the multiplication of falsified indebtedness upon the world? No. Have they saved a government? Have they made it possible to implement or impose what we call austerity? No. Have they saved anyone from foreclosure? No. Why not? They're not even interchangeable with the other currency. You see? So the only thing that's going to save us is the only currency which can save us, and that currency is a currency which represents our promissory obligations without exploitation, and subjects those promissory obligations to an obligatory schedule of payment, retiring principal at the rate at which we consume of the related property. We pay for a house as we consume of it. And this alone maintains a circulation which is equal to the remaining value of the house, which makes the circulation equal to all the things that it represents, and therefore immutable in value. And we don't achieve this by alternate currencies or further banks, and there's just literally thousands of these propositions all over the world, and all that they're brought up by is 11th hour pretenders who are claiming that somehow they're doing us a service of some kind. But they've never done the math, because if they had, they'd realize you cannot do an alternate currency. You have to have one currency. The alternate currencies can never be truly interchangeable, and the reason is, if they exist by different principles, which would be comprised by different currencies, then they're not truly interchangeable. If one currency just represents 10 ducks that are going to multiply into 100 ducks, for instance, without respect to anything else, then that currency isn't interchangeable with a currency that equals however many ducks are in existence. You see, no one who holds a currency that's truly redeemable in ducks is going to trade it for a currency which isn't redeemable in ducks, because it's not fixed to the volume of ducks or an obligation to redeem the currency in so many ducks, or to pay that currency for however many ducks that exist. All those principles are implemented by mathematically perfected economy, and mathematically perfected economy alone. So we're not attacking one person or one particular bank here. This is one person attempting to defend their bank, when in truth it's an indefensible proposition. We are ourselves to be faulted, because the solution has existed for so long, and it's so easy to master, and yet, if we're inactive in regard to a responsibility to understand how to manage our own affairs, we're to blame, and this is why a proposition like this has any support whatsoever. I wanted to get that out of the way that it can't solve our issues and so on and so forth. The other thing is that these people bring up these ideas, and little by little they morph them into toward mathematically perfected economy, making such preposterous assumptions as we witnessed, that a rate of payment which is 4 times what it would be under mathematically perfected economy makes no difference, because in the end you've paid the same. Well, it of course makes difference, because you're paying it all in 1/4 of the time. You're paying 4 times as much. That leaves you 75% less to budget for other things which comprise your standard of living or prosperity. So obviously it makes a huge difference, and getting the math right is the only thing that comprises an immutable currency. If you paid it out of circulation, you lack representation for it. So and although that representation isn't directly applied to a home, for instance, as it's being consumed, it does sustain further economic activity, industry and commerce, which comprise our prosperity. So it is important that we're paying for a home as we consume of it, because from a greater remaining circulation, and one that's no greater than it can or should be, we're able to sustain the industry and commerce which enable us to pay for those things as we consume of them. So the time, the costs are all very important. And when it comes down to it, you heard this person that we had this discussion with, claim that you couldn't pay the interest because it didn't exist in circulation. This is why we have to understand all this plagiarism. It's because the wrong ideas are not credible. If we have people going to court claiming there is no debt, or that the money's created out of thin air, or that you can't pay the interest because it doesn't exist in circulation, and someone can prove, as we can prove in seconds, how it's possible to pay all the debts and interest in existence from a circulation of a single dollar, if and only if we can earn that dollar enough times at such a rate from the back from the banking system, so that we can service the debts and their interest, then of course it's not a fact at all. The problem is that you can't earn it back from the banks at that rate. So these people going to courts because they have to defend themselves, claiming these false arguments that come from plagiarists and pretenders and imposters who've risen up at the 11th hour as if they understand what the issues are, and falsely cite them, destroy our credibility, because when we stand up in court, what happens is, we say something that seems to be similar to what all these other people have said, which are proven not to be a fact. When you say you don't have a debt, you signed a contract to assume a debt. You have a debt. The question is, who is the debt to? Is it to the banking system, which gave no value to the money itself? The money didn't even exist. It gave up no lawful consideration commensurable to the money or the debt it falsifies to itself. It has no property at stake which would justify interest. Those are the facts of the matter. And if we argue anything else, we're only discrediting not only ourselves, but everyone who comes after us, who should have come before, but these people race out there as if they understand the issues and are going to argue them on false grounds, that the money is created out of thin air. It's not created out of thin air. That there's circulatory inflation. There isn't circulatory inflation. We suffer a deficiency of currency in circulation. That the interest doesn't exist, therefore you can't pay it. Well, of course you can pay it, because you could earn it from a bank. The question is whether or not all of us can earn it. And the facts of the matter are so simple. I mean, you should be raising these yourselves. Earlier in the lifespan of the system, not only is it possible to pay the interest, but we pay off the debts with the interest. People paid their houses off, and they have for many years until the later stages of the lifespan. A newborn child comes into the world with whatever, 350,000 or $35,000 of debt for things that they've never benefited from in their life and will never benefit from. They've been consumed. And so they're born into the world with debt, and that debt can only get increased during their lifespans. And it's not for receiving further things, it's for this obfuscation of the currency, increasing the sum of debt, until it finally exceeds any possibility of servicing it, because the debt gets greater than we can service, which destroys our creditworthiness to maintain a vital circulation. The circulation disappears, which is a problem, you see. A disappearing circulation under terminal indebtedness, that's the reason for the global monetary failure. And the solution to this, as we've explained for weeks and weeks and weeks, is singular. There's one and one only solution, and it's a restoration of the universal right to issue promissory obligations. The people are the issuers of money. To issue unexploited promissory obligations subject to an obligatory schedule of payment which retires principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. That's it in a nutshell. That's what we're after. That's the only thing that can serve us. So even when we create money to finance government, that is the people creating money collectively for some kind of initiative. In the private sector, which is most of our industry and commerce, the people are the creators of the money likewise, because we assume promissory obligations. Now, the lie that we have to borrow our own promissory obligations from a banking system is our problem. Our own stupidity, our own ignorance is our problem. Until we get over that, we're not going anywhere. Well, we have a number of people coming forth from different parts of the world who want to try these arguments in court. So far, our arguments have not been tried in court because a banking system and a government which serves a banking system does not want those arguments in court. Why? Because they defeat the banking system, they will eradicate banking forever and replace it with the only solution. So our mandate is the actual proofs that the currency is obfuscated into falsified debts to the banks, whereas they should remain promissory obligations to pay and to retire principal from circulation. Then those falsified debts are subject to interest, which imposes this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation, because we're paying principal and interest out of a circulation which is only comprised of some remaining principal. So this, because the banking system can't absorb so much of our production, forces us to borrow principal back into circulation as new debt equal to the former sum of debt, making it mathematically impossible to pay down the sum of debt, whereas the interest that we're paying out of circulation counted none against any prior sum of debt. So when we borrow it into circulation, it comprises new debt above the former sum of debt. So therefore, combining those two facts together indicates that the sum of debt then increases perpetually by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt, until even at an inherently escalating rate then we inevitably suffer a terminal sum of debt which exceeds our creditworthiness to borrow further and to maintain a vital circulation. So that's why we have the global monetary failure. My work proved this in 1968 and has ever since. No one has invalidated this thesis. Roger Hayes claimed that people understood him better because he tells them that we can't pay the interest because the interest doesn't exist. But that isn't a fact at all. We can pay the interest, but we can only pay the interest by borrowing it back into circulation when we pay it out, which increases the sum of debt. That's the problem. It isn't that we can't pay the interest. So, being as it's not even true what he's saying, he can't say that people were understanding him better because he made it into something simpler. He made it into something which isn't even true. And anybody who believes they understood him understood nothing. Therefore, there is nothing of the kind which can be understood. So this is why we don't want these imposters stepping forward and claiming our attention to do something, which they even advocated against. He claimed we shouldn't have, banks, private banks decide, what money comes into circulation or what conditions it comes into circulation. And then he goes and proposes that very thing. So, we need to realize that there's one solution and that it already exists. Once we have it, we would readily understand that everyone else who claims that something else solves it has to be wrong. We don't have to go any farther than this simple proof that 3 categoric faults are solved. That is, volumetric and dispositional improprieties are solved. The only things that can be wrong with money are the volume of money and the disposition of money. And we give a second categoric fault as the combination of those two things, which is a sort of an overlapping area that we could say is not even a second categoric fault. We have, in fact, 2 of them. I mean, those are matters of semantics and conceptualization. The 3 is more or less how you naturally realize all these things. As I explained, when I was, 16, I took this idea home and realized it prescribed mathematically perfected economy because it solved the volumetric improprieties of inflation and deflation, because it maintained a circulation which was always equal to the remaining value of represented property. It also solved the dispositional improprieties of interest, which dedicated ever more of a circulation to servicing an escalating sum of falsified debt. And of course, then there was everything that was neither of those 2 things, and I realized then that it was all the rest of the things were a combination of those 2 things, which I've since called systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And the reason that this fits is because it affects the value of money or property upwardly or downwardly, and the only tools for doing so, of course, are the volumetric or dispositional improprieties, potential improprieties of money. So that's it in a nutshell. We have one solution, and what are we going to do from here on out is the question. How do we implement this when government is serving the banks, is attempting to persist in this escalation of debt upon us, is attempting to make us service it to a small degree they're calling austerity, which small degree isn't even as much as it's continuing to increase, presumably to arrest terminal failure. But they're actually, by standing for the banking system, they're persisting in the causes of terminal failure, because the banking system will continue to multiply debt even beyond a terminal sum of debt so long as we artificially sustain the system. So we have to deal with a government which isn't serving us. We have to deal with a banking system which isn't servicing them. Are we going to get anywhere by asking their permission to do the right thing? No. Are we going to get anywhere if instead of uniting behind a solution, we divide off into countless different currencies and banks and purported principles: love-based money, resource-based money, energy-based money, gold or silver-based money, a precious metal monetary standard? No. None of these propositions solves all the requisites of a solution. So having that, we shouldn't be dividing, but we are. We are our own worst enemy, as Jack Shaw, for instance, constantly reminds us. The ruling elite have to be dying laughing at us. Because all we do is divide up and to propose another bank. Some person here wants to be our CMI now, or I was just informed a couple of days ago, somebody is, even more closely imitating mathematically perfected economy, and, they've got a new BIBO currency, BIBO, and, while they claim that stability has to exist, they don't even realize that an alternate currency can achieve the objects they're claiming, which are just my objects that they're repeating in their website with a donation button on the top of it, So that's where all this stuff is headed. So what are we going to do? Are we going to wake up here or what? So those are the things I wanted to get out of the way here before I really got rolling. Hopefully Ivan's here. Ivan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Mike.
Great. We thought we'd talk about a few other things. Ivan had some things that he'd like to bring up, and we'd like to bash around. We're hoping this coming week to educate a few further initiatives on this strategy of this mandate, which enables each person to have the arguments to prove the obfuscation, to prove its injustices are terminal, to prove there's one solution and one rightful state of their promissory obligation. And that's what it would have been under mathematically perfected economy if they had mathematically perfected economy all the while. So we're moving forward. What these people will do if they intend ultimately to exercise these arguments is they will take some preemptive actions. They will notify their courthouse, their sheriff, their district attorney, whatever authorities may become involved. They will notify them of their arguments. They will present these things with what I call rights claimant forms. Then they will go to their bank and they will present rights claimant forms with the same arguments to the bank as well. They will issue an irredeemable promise to pay, not to pay their obfuscated, falsified debt, but to resolve it in the terms by which it was created, which means that if the banks have, as private entities, rights or authorities to do such a thing, they can't be denied private citizens. So on the one hand, it would decide on our favor in that matter. On the other hand, if the banks should have these authorities, which we're arguing they should not, but if the court were to decide that they should, in favor of the existing system, in other words, we are resolving it. And we're forcing them to prove the justice of the system then. But we're not claiming that that pays the debt or that a debt doesn't exist. We signed a contract to a debt and we issued a promissory obligation, which has been obfuscated into a falsified debt subject to interest. We're restoring it to an unexploited debt free of interest, subject to an obligatory schedule of payment by the arguments of mathematically perfected economy, which will generally put everyone 12 times ahead of their schedule of payment. So we provide these arguments to the bank, not in as full as we would to the sheriff, to the district attorney, and to the court, for example. But we do this and we issue an irredeemable promise to pay to resolve the falsified debt in like manner and kind. And then we contest in court their breach of trust and offer for them, and we insist that our promissory obligations be reverted to their only rightful state by these arguments, and we submit willingly to the remaining balance, if any. Most of us will have paid off our debts. Just counting all prior payments of interest toward principal will resolve most of the debt of the world, including your government debt, which people are acting against. So this is the basic strategy of all this, and we're educating people. We're having meetings on the details of this. Now, anybody that wants to become involved in these processes can contact myself, can contact Ivan, can contact Vincent, Byrne. We can, involve you in this if you're needing to go forward immediately yourselves. This help is free. You do have to realize how you're going to apply these arguments, but because they're articulated in this mandate, you don't have to be able to articulate them yourselves. So the mandate becomes a tool by which we're each claiming sovereign rights as individuals to mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation. The mandate is itself a proof of abuse of power, of some of the greatest crimes against humanity ever. And it's our tool to do this, a tool which is indispensable to you, the only kind of a tool which will work against an abusive government and a banking system which isn't about to allow any of these other banks to ever rise up in the first place. And you have to understand that's another thing about this lawful bank. There is no law which entitles anyone to create such a thing at this time. Unless you change the law, that bank will go down in flames before it even becomes a physical or even an intellectual reality. Understand that its principles haven't been decided even yet, that 100 people were supposed to get together and decide this in some democratic manner, when the only principles it will service have already been decided, and they don't require the 100 people. So this is why we have to get our own heads together. So that's as much as I intended to lay out to begin the program anyway. So what do you think, Ivan? Where do we go from here?
I think if you can maybe run through the stages from the moment that debt is falsified, and then what ensues after that, and then I'll have a look out in the chat box, and if people don't get a certain part, or maybe how about we'll do it this way. I'll start with one part, right, and then you go on to the next one.
Well, I think a little bit better idea than that is first we have to return to how does a promissory obligation work in nature.
And by promissory obligation, you mean like promissory obligation can be
any kind of contract
really
is a promissory obligation.
Any kind of contract. It's not really about the notes. Yeah. It's like if
any
I promise
kind of
you,
contract is a promissory obligation.
Yeah, so that's what you mean by promissory.
A contract to sell stocks short is a promissory obligation. A contract to sell stocks long is a promissory obligation. Any kind of contract is a promissory obligation. But as I explained in my parable of perfect economy, promissory obligations are indispensable to modern commerce, where we trade production of unlike kinds indirectly to people that we purchase from. Basically, say we went to a market and you had a goat and 2 sheep, and I had a sheepdog, and it was an extra dog that I'd, out of a litter that I'd got started, on sheep raising, and you had a couple extra sheep and this goat, you brought that day. Well, you might need this dog, but I don't want your 2 sheep and your goat. You see, that's a problem in barter. So what might happen in that market is you might go around the market and you try and find somebody who needs a dog of the kind that I have. It's a young dog that's started, might be relatively well trained, valuable. So you present the dog for what it is, and you ask who wants it, and you're hoping to find someone who wants a dog that so that but would be willing to accept your sheep, so you could have, and goats, so you could have. I meant to say wants your sheep and goat, so that you can get the dog for the sheep and the goat. But what money is something which we can't really say was an innovation. It's something that sort of naturally arises. And the story of my parable of perfect economy is a perfect case example. We had two people. One grows feed and the other raises chickens, and the fellow that raises chickens says to his neighbor who raises feed, that he's going to double his production in the next year, but he's not going to be able to grow the extra feed that he needs. So for so much of the extra production would he produce the feed. So they enter into an agreement that the man who raises feed is going to produce so much feed over such and such a period of time in exchange for so much of the fowl production. So these are promissory obligations. And of course, this man who raises the feed may not need so many fowl as he's going to be awarded for producing the feed. So he may write a further promissory obligation against the promissory obligation that he has for the fowl. Let's just say it's 2,000 fowl that he's to receive, much more than he and his family can eat during the year. Well, he says to his cousins, well, would you take so much of these chickens and trade for that wagon that you built, or would you repair my plow, or whatever? And he might say to the mercantile store, would you take a promissory obligation against so many of these chickens? So in effect, my promissory obligation, if I'm the man who raises the fowl, for instance, my promissory obligation is divided into parts which are distributed about the community who wants that share of my production. Well, money would be the next step. Money would be like a uniform form of promissory obligations. Let's say now our trade extended beyond our village to the next village over, which was maybe a long ways away in early times. We don't know everyone there. So when someone there issues a promissory obligation, we don't know if it has integrity. Will we be able to collect those 200 chickens against a $2,000 or 2,000 chicken promissory obligation when the time comes? That person may not even exist. Somebody counterfeited it, for example. Well, how do we resolve that? We out of a joint interest in under the auspices of government, then we form an entity that says, okay, you're so and so, we make you credit worthy, and we actually maintain your account. So instead of issuing you a promissory obligation directly, I say, well, I'm producing 2,000 chickens a year, or let's say 5,000. I'm going to increase that to 10,000, out of which I'm paying 2,000 a year to Ivan for producing the feed for me. All right, and they look at your farm or whatever it takes to certify your creditworthiness, and they see what, well, he has doubled his facilities, and he's got the brood stock, he's got everything. Of course, he could get struck by disease or whatever, but is that going to wipe it out? Is it going to make it impossible for him to deliver those 2,000 chickens to Ivan? Well, it looks good by the standards that we've decided to apply to each other for creditworthiness. This one gets a green light. So instead of producing the chickens for it, what happens is we just award, let's say they're $1 a chicken, we award the $2,000 to Ivan, the creditor, all right, because he's giving up feed for this. So as he produces the feed, he gets $2,000 for it. So he can just spend that around the community then. It doesn't matter about the integrity of writing further promissory obligations is eliminated because it's a universal form of a promissory obligation that can be spent for anything because we've monetized our production. And the end, what happens is I sell those 2,000 chickens for $2,000, pay it to the common monetary infrastructure, which resolves my debt to Ivan. And so it's retired from circulation because it no longer represents value. It belongs to nothing. It's evidence of the possession of no one. So that's the thing that people have to get their brain around. That's the life cycle of a promissory obligation. All that happens in a banking system is instead of doing this through government, the bank says, oh, we have to do it. And it pays some people in government to pass an act which gives them the authority to the wrongful authority to merely publish further evidence of our promissory obligations. The very same money is all that they produce at negligible cost, but they pretend we have to borrow it from them. Doesn't even exist. They create it when we sign a promissory obligation, when we do the same acts that we had in the former situation, and they produce the money, but they pretend it's their possession. We have to pay it back to them, and they are entitled to it much more because it's that falsified entitlement is purportedly subject to risk, although the risk is only the cost of printing the money. They impose interest on it. And now, instead of just paying the debt to Ivan, I've got to pay a multiple of it out of a circulation which is only equal to the debt to Ivan. So what happens? In order to finish paying all of our debts, we have to borrow this back into circulation, and so we're paying principal and interest out of a circulation comprised of only some principal, and the principal comprises new debt equal to the old, making it mathematically impossible to pay down any former sum of debt, and the interest counted none against the former sum of debt and his new debt. So the sum of debt starts escalating on us. And yes, we can pay off the initial debt because I can produce 3,000 chickens, and that debt might be multiplied by 1.5, okay? But when it gets beyond my production, no longer can I service the debt. So as it increases and increases and increases and increases, my margins of solubility and my prosperity diminish, though my production might even be going up. I might be forced to produce more and more and more for some while. We can say, well, we're producing more, and and the price is the same for some while, so we're all better off. But the truth is that we're not, because we're getting less of our own production while we're forced to produce more. But nonetheless, this obfuscation of the currency that's imposed by banking perpetually multiplies falsified debts to the bank into terminal debts. So that's the whole situation. That's both cases right there. So what we're looking for is to restore the falsified promissory obligations or debts subject to interest to their rightful state, as they would be if we weren't denied representation or government. And so that equates to mathematically perfected economy. We remove interest and we pay these promissory obligations at the rate at which we consume of the related property. So I would pay the promissory obligation for the feed as I consume of the feed. And so the $2,000 would be paid out of circulation as I would deliver the chickens to Ivan. Except that being as Ivan had already been paid, my payments, which don't, the restoration of all this doesn't alleviate the fact that I have a debt. But since Ivan has already been paid by awarding him the $2,000, then my payments then have to be retired from circulation. So that's the simple cycle of it all, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So if we just you started with the nature of the promissory obligation, and you basically explained something that I think every child would know, that if you promise to deliver something and you delivered it, then there is no more promissory obligation and there is no more need to deliver anything, right? That's basic.
Exactly, and a child
Yeah,
will
and
understand that. Yes.
everybody will understand that.
Yeah.
So
Adults want to argue, but a child will understand it.
Yeah. Now, how does that how does that work now with the system that we have at the moment? So the first thing I think everybody needs to understand is the debt is, well, most of the people on TNS probably would know that debt is false, that there is no debt to the bank. But like we said before, if you go to the bank and you argue that there is no debt to the bank, well, there is something aching for a debt. That there's something you got a property. The guy who gave up the property got the money. So there's something. It's not exactly right. That's why the judges won't, go with that, because the judges know, even if they can explain it themselves and we can explain, they know that it's not right. So if we take from then the debt is falsified to the banks. For a few reasons, right? First of all, because the banks themselves do not give up any property. They only pretend to give up any commensurable consideration to the debt that they falsify, which basically means that there's nothing even remotely equal to the debt that they claim that exists to them. So that's the first thing. The second thing, if they loaned us money, and or actually by us signing the loan agreement or the mortgage, we create the money. How could they loan it to us if they didn't have it before?
Right.
So that's the second thing. So how could they give us something if they never had any prior possessions of it? And the other thing that I read from the mandate as well, you say that because the only way for banks to make profit is through interest, how is it even possible for them to even have any such large amounts of property?
I'd say it a little differently.
Be able to monetize.
Yeah, I'd say it a little differently. Because the principal isn't their possession. It's only rightfully retired from circulation when it's paid. Therefore, it can't represent the possession even then to the banking system. And because interest is unwarranted, because they're charging interest, they don't award you when you're the real creditor who gave up property. They don't award you interest. They pretend that they're a creditor loaning something which doesn't even exist to you, which is a representation of your own promissory obligation, and you're the only one who gives it value. You see, they don't give it any value. So they have nothing at stake. Nothing justifies interest, especially since interest is terminal. That alone forces us to attempt to do the right thing. But so, since interest is unjustifiable, it's not only unjustified, it's unjustifiable, and the arguments of the mandate prove this. There are proof that there is no case whatsoever that the banking system should be entitled to interest. And so, since interest is unjustified and the principal doesn't belong to them, that means that nothing goes to the banking system except the costs of publishing these further representations of our promissory obligations. And in the early 1970s, it cost 1/10 of a cent per bill, regardless of denomination, to publish physical forms of money. And of course, if there's not physical forms, it costs even less than that, because it's just a record, which is kept today digitally, So, nonetheless, there's no legitimate means by which the banking system is enriched by these processes, because it's an obfuscation. It's falsified debt, which isn't even owed to the banking system, which is owed, and the payments of which are retired from circulation. It doesn't represent value anymore when it's paid. As we just said, children would understand this. You issue a promissory obligation, you pay it off. It doesn't represent any obligation any longer to deliver anything of value. Period. It's fulfilled. It's null and void. And that's the net. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, that's the natural life cycle of a promissory obligation. Go ahead, Ivan. I was done then.
I just wanted to add, uh, for the folks in the chat box, I can be both in the chat box and answering everybody's questions and participating in discussion with Mike. I think actually, if you really want to, understand this, you should maybe stop asking so many questions and maybe take notes for yourself. And then what we'll do is, when we finish or sort of draw it closer towards the end of the show, or just maybe like the later part of it, you can ask questions, because some of the things we're going to be actually addressing. So there's no point of asking questions. We're going to be covering that. So we established that the debt doesn't exist to the banks, but the debt does exist, however, to the original creditor, and it's not exactly a debt. It's just a promise that we made, that we're going to be repaying through the life cycle, to lifespan of the represented property, with our own equal production at the rate of consumption or depreciation.
Yeah, so let's cover that issue a little bit, because some of the questions may be about that. Here's what happens when the real creditor. Let's go back to our $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan example. Here's what's going on. The builder of the home, who sells it to us for $100,000, is paid in full. They have $100,000 or pounds or whatever, yen. Well, that $100,000 is a representation of entitlement. It's an entitlement to a like volume of production, whatever they choose to have for it. They're a free market. They're a creditor who possesses entitlement for which they've given up property. So their $100,000, which they're issued in full, represents their entitlement from the overall pool of wealth to spend that $100,000 on whatever volume of production they wish to enjoy as their own prosperity. Our obligation as the obligor, what we used to say debtor, but I prefer the word obligor, because in truth, a promissory obligation isn't really a debt for all of it. It's an obligation to pay for it as something as we consume of it. Partway down the lifespan, somebody else might take ownership from us, and resume the obligation for the remainder of the lifespan, and they would simply take over the payments if we hadn't paid for any equity in the object. So in the end, what is happening is the obligor is committed to an obligation to contribute a volume of wealth to the overall pool of wealth, which volume is equal to what the creditor has received or will receive when they spend that entitlement against the overall pool of wealth. We're trading like volumes of different production. Now, how do we know those are like volumes? We decide relative to each other's production what our price is for our production and what we will pay for the production of others. Because what others are charging above their costs, which are already fixed into their production, what they're charging is for their contribution. So this is how we today, even under this system, we attempt to determine the relative value of others' work. We look at a carpenter as their work might compare to our work, and we decide whether or not per hour we work as hard or it involves as much skill, so on and so forth. But what happens in this life cycle then is that ultimately the production of the obligor is purchased by the market. And it could be this creditor, in fact, who purchases it and says, whatever you've given up is worth the same volume of money. And so by comparing our own contributions to the overall pool of wealth, we discern ourselves and decide between ourselves what's the rightful price. Under mathematically perfected economy only are we free to do so, truly, because under a system of exploitation, more and more and more of the circulation is dedicated to servicing debt. So for every dollar we spend or unit of currency that we spend, less and less and less of it goes to the actual producer. If their price is the same, so they're forced to increase their prices to get enough to keep themselves over the escalated sum of debt that they're servicing. But back to this cycle, what happens is the obligor, their contribution to the overall pool of wealth is certified by the fact that people paid them that. So they are paid that $100,000 that was paid to the real creditor who produced the house, and in paying that $100,000 debt, it's paid out to the common monetary infrastructure at the rate that you consume of the house. And so in the end, by retiring the principal, we maintain a circulation equal to the remaining value of the pool of wealth, and maintain an immutable currency thereby, and everyone is paying for the production of everyone else with an equal volume of their own production, which is certified again by we the people. We're the free market, and we decide what each other's work is. And so whatever the obligor is paid is what everybody said, oh, I'll pay that for it. I'll pay my $10,000, and somebody else said they'll pay their $1,000 for this much of the production, until $100,000 of the production of the obligor has been paid for and paid against their obligation to pay for this $100,000 house, which payments are retired from circulation. So that's the cycle of it under a monetary system. And so mathematically perfected economy is the monetary equivalent of barter. That doesn't make it exactly the same as barter, because it has the additional advantages of that the currency is universal. You don't have to go to the market with a dog wanting 2 sheep and a goat to make the trade to the person who wants the dog. Instead, you sell the dog for the price that you want, and whatever you want, which isn't 2 sheep and a goat, you spend what you get for the dog on it. You see, money, just this process monetizes our production so that we can pay for the production of others with no more than equal measure of our own production. We certainly don't need banks to do that. We certainly don't need to pretend that we borrow evidence of our own promissory obligations into existence and pay to an entity which only produces the further representations, not only the principal, but all the interest, which forces this implicit obligation upon us to maintain a vital circulation, which forces us to borrow the principal and interest back into circulation to continue servicing the initial debts, and all the while we're accumulating an ever greater sum of debt until we finally succumb to a terminal sum of debt. That's the whole problem of the world right now.
Yeah. So where are we on the cycle then at the moment? We explained that the debt is not to the banks. We explained about the nature of the promissory obligation, with the other way around. First was the nature and then the debt. So because there's no debt to the banks and there is a debt somewhere, what we then need to do, or no, he was covering something else there.
Well,
just a second ago.
No, we've wrapped up the promissory obligation and the currency under the banking system and under mathematically perfected economy. We've already really addressed them. All that has to happen with these payments of the promissory obligation is they have to go somewhere to certify that they're paid. And when they're paid, they're retired. The promissory obligation to the real creditor who gave up the house is fulfilled. It's just like in the child's example. We issued a piece of paper basically to the person who gave us the house saying we would pay for the house with an equal volume of our own production. And the creditor said great, because they could spend that piece of paper on whatever they wanted, which was fruit and food and cars and, landscaping and whatever. They spend that piece of paper however they will, and that piece of paper has legitimate value because it represents an obligation to contribute that volume of whatever in our own production to the overall pool of wealth, and it's all certified and enforced. In the case of default, the remaining value of the property equals the remaining debt, so that protects us. We can confiscate the property as we do under the present system to protect society. Basically, the debt is to society because the creditor is paid in full. The debt is to society, and the debt is to pay with an equal volume of our production and to maintain an immutable currency. We pay at the rate of consumption and retire the principal. And that's it in a nutshell. That's the mathematics that resolves all the considerations which to some people seem complicated, but they're simply the things that they've never resolved themselves. So they seem like further matters, but they're the matters that are impossible to resolve under the present system, which pretends to be an economy, which in fact is a system of exploitation, which exploits us by multiplying indebtedness upon us and redundant costliness, because the indebtedness is falsified and is perpetually increased by interest. So it's not an economy. What we have is not an economy. It's a system of exploitation. It's not enough to say that, and it's not enough to think that. We have to understand how it's done if we're to unite and decide, well, no, it's not going to be a bank that saves us, a private bank, another private bank. It's not going to be an alternate currency. It's all the currency has to be this, because we have to resolve all these debts. Let's just suppose half of society wanted to adopt mathematically perfected economy immediately, for example. All right? So, and half didn't. Well, the half that don't would be perpetrating a crime against the rest of us for failing to rise to the occasion, because in continuing to service their debts, they would deflate the circulation, so we would continue to spiral downward into failure. We need all of us to realize that this is the only monetary justice. Whatever else we've ever thought is wrong. It's not my way or the highway. The fact of the matter is the debts are falsified, interest is unwarranted, this results in terminal failure, and there's only one solution of all these matters, which maintains an immutable currency by a perpetual one-to-one-to-one relationship between remaining circulation, remaining value of represented property, and remaining obligation to pay just that much for the remaining value of represented property. There's no other means to persist in immutable value in currency and property. So we have one solution, and we have one way of getting there as well, and that is to restore our falsified debts to their rightful state as promissory obligations, which counts all prior payments of interest instead toward principal, and then resumes payment at the obligatory schedule of payment under mathematically perfected economy, which is, being as the rate of payment is about 1/12 as much, means that if you've paid against a property for 5 years under the present system, that equates to about 12 years of payment under mathematically perfected economy. Not only are you not in foreclosure, you don't have another payment for another 55 years. And when you have another payment to resume, if you have any remaining balance at all, those payments are going to be about 1/12 what they are now. So even that far off in the future, we're 12 times as liquid without any other further benefit, which means without even restoring our industry to each country and employment, to full employment to every country. Even under what is actually a depression already, we would be 12 times as liquid. We would be out of foreclosure. We wouldn't be making any payments on our debts for 12 times into the future what we already have, if there's any remaining balance at all. And if there is any remaining balance, the payments against the debt, the remaining debt, would be about 1/12 they are. So that's the those are the ramifications of adopting mathematically perfected economy.
Mm-hmm.
Every moment that we delay is only costing us further and bringing us closer to the worst ramifications of the inevitable failure of the present obfuscation. This is merely a means of defrauding us from our own production, dispossessing us of our own production to an inevitably terminal extent. And,
Yeah.
and
Sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just about finished. All I was going to say is that the only thing holding us back is ourselves. Government isn't ever going to give us the green light to do the right thing. They're in the pockets of the bankers. The bankers are never going to give up banking. That's the only thing they're here to do. That's a grand scheme. They're not going to give it up. If we ever want the right thing, the only way that we're going to have it is to stand for it. You see, and the process is to resolve all of our debts on not only an individual basis but a collective basis through this mandate, and to create a common monetary infrastructure. And as I explained to Ann Sidney Mitch years ago, basically it doesn't matter that we don't pay on against our debts for quite some while, because we have 12 times off into the future that any of us would resume our debts. So if we've paid for 1 month against anything, that would mean that it's a year before we should make another payment. Or if we paid a year, it should be 12 years. So we can easily take a year time out. Nobody services their debts at all. We just go on with the money that we have, earning it and spending it on our standard of living, not against any of our debts as arise from this so-called banking system, until we create this common monetary infrastructure in each country, and that adopts mathematically perfected economy and sustain mathematically perfected economy by these simple principles of certifying creditworthiness by whatever standards we want to impose upon ourselves, and then enforcing these, and the common monetary infrastructure executes it all. So it just you don't get a bill for your house and then send it back with a payment. It just comes out of your account. We don't even have to print money and carry money around. It just comes out of an account. We would have probably whatever we want to do, but we could have like a debit card to our banking accounts, and whatever chosen alternate methods of certifying our identity, and that would be it. That links our transactions to our accounts, and they're just all of the processes are executed through the CMI. You don't pay your utility bill any longer. You signed a contract to pay for your electricity according to however much you use, and whatever rates decided to be charged for that, and it just comes out of your accounts. You don't pay against a mortgage. It just comes out of your accounts. You don't go down to the bank and deposit your paycheck. Your employer's payments are deposited into your account. We just automate the whole damn thing. We get exploitation out of the way, and we maintain an immutable currency, an ability to exchange our production for like volumes of others' production by this eradication of exploitation and obligatory schedule of payment. Two things solve all of our problems: eradicating exploitation and an obligatory schedule of payment, which maintains a circulation which is always equal to the remaining value of the property it represents. Period. That's all there is to it. All the rest is explaining how and why those two simple facts solve all of our issues.
Yeah. I just want to add to you were talking there about the ramifications of the MPE. I think a lot of people on TNS, I mean that's what I can see, are missing a crucial point there, that this is MPE and 100% consensual representation. That bit is crucial because I think a lot of people look at a possibility of having MPE through the old, the current system scope. So they still apply the same standards, kind of like, politicians and stuff like that. But if anybody is familiar with sovereign republic, you have to look at it from a different perspective, where you have a sovereign republic where everything is actually available to public scrutiny, and you don't have the same government that we have at the moment, which is denying representation from all of us by the political structure that we have.
Right, a typical strategy of the government, which serves the banking system, is to promise us one thing, to campaign as if it's going to create more jobs, for instance. Whereas the banking system, which it's going to perpetuate, can only destroy more jobs. So by falsely borrowing further money from the banking system to create more jobs, to finance some huge corporations that are going to frack our slate substrate across the country, ruin our water supplies, and supposedly create new jobs for natural gas, while that little money to do so, relatively little, is going to disappear in the payments of the servicing of the debt, forcing further debt upon us, which is going to destroy all the jobs that are created. So all this is a lie. Now, they also promise many things that they can't deliver and never even really truly intend to deliver. Well, we have to decide whether or not we're going to have representation. If a candidate campaigns to deliver something, we need to say, well, you have to show us how that's going to happen. Not just show us how, you have to prove how it's going to happen. Well, what if somebody can prove that that's impossible? Well, it might behoove us then to force that candidate to withdraw, not by deciding so at the moment, but by some structure that we don't even have, but establishing that as a standard of politics. If you assert that something solves a problem and someone can prove it won't, then you have to withdraw from the race. If someone can disprove your means, you have to withdraw from the race. Get all the pretenders out of the picture. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly how to do these things, but in truth, those are things that we have to do if we're ever going to restore right justice. So people might think, oh, we'll never do that. Government's never going to do that. Well, they're not, unless we force them to do it, you see? And that's going to be by declaring what are the parameters of government. We have to declare what are the bounds of just government. As I have often said, for instance, the 1912 Democrat Party platform promised not to create a central bank. The Republicans advocated creation of a central bank, promising it would solve all the problems it can only cause. Republicans would have been ejected from the race because the proposition was entirely deceptive. In other words, it promised to deliver not only what the proposition couldn't deliver, but it promised to solve what the proposition caused. So they're out. But then the Democrats were elected because they promised not to create a central bank, and then they immediately went about creating one. All right? Now, so you need a law, a standard for elections, which says, oh, you promised to do this, that's what you have to do. That's it. Period. You violate that, you're out of office. All right? So now, not only do they do it, but they create that act, the Federal Reserve Act, on the eve of December 23rd, 1913. All right? Now, they promised to solve all the problems they could only cause, but were the arguments concrete? No, because they were purpose deceptions. So what about purpose deceptions? Anything which is inaccurate has to disqualify an act. You can't have acts founded on false principles. If one person can disprove that, you need a means that their disproof disqualifies the acts. And we would never have had a Federal Reserve Act even after it was passed, but certainly not even while it was being attempted to be passed, if we had just had that standard. These are the things that I mean by absolute consensual representation. But suppose it even gets beyond that, and no one stood up and disproved that it could achieve whatever it promised to achieve. It at least has to be subject to public assent. After all, you promise not to do this. You promise it's going to solve the things it can only cause, and then you pass it in violation of both deceptions, and it's never subjected to public assent. Well, of course we get bad government if we allow this to happen. So what is absolute consensual representation? It's standards which prevent each one of those steps from ever happening, which provides us means of stopping abuse of power. Okay, so now it's even past that stage. And what happens in 15 years, no more than 15 years, it imposes the first international global depression, the so-called First Great Depression. Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913. 15 years later, 16 years later, 15 and point something years later, we have the stock market crash precipitating in marking the beginning of the First Great Depression, which is not a consequence of the stock market crash. It's a consequence of multiplication of falsified indebtedness upon industry and commerce, which could no longer sustain those debts. So, what happens in 15 years? All those lies are proven to be lies. They impose the greatest monetary failure in history to the present time. We endure that for 10 years of depression and several years of World War II before, on the opposite end of World War II, they decide to just give us back creditworthiness and start the whole thing again. Because, if you want to steal from people, it's better to steal from people who are producing. So they start the whole thing over again. They restrain themselves in way of interest rates and whatnot, and we have greater industrial expansion even, and so the thing lasts a little longer than it did the first time around. So we have a second Great Depression now, right? And yet we can't even stand against that. No, we need provision. We need to modify representative government so that it gives us representation. So we have true checks and balances for everything that goes awry. The founders of the United States in our Constitution meant for us to do these things. They meant for us to secure our rights and liberties as they were proven necessary to be protected by whatever further measures. These aren't radical ideas. When someone lies to you and they can rise to power on false promises which can never be delivered by the means that they're proposing, in fact, those means not only won't deliver us further prosperity. Do you know that when Herbert Hoover took his accepted in his acceptance speech to the Republican nomination, he said we were within years of eradicating poverty forever. 1 year before the Great Depression, in his acceptance speech for the Republican nomination, he said we were within years of eradicating poverty forever. You see, we have to hold these people accountable, and this mandate does that. Everything that I have just mentioned is cut off. This isn't some 11th hour idea like all these purported banks and alternate currencies. This is 44 years of engineering says these are the problems, these are the solutions for all of these problems. And you're not going to have mathematically perfected economy if you don't want representation. And if you don't want representation, what you really need is a benevolent dictator, you know. And that's not a solution. You can't count on having a benevolent dictator. That's why the so-called mood message for my Skype ID is a quote of Edith Hamilton. When the freedom they desired most was the freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and never was free again.
Yep, that's a great quote.
Yeah, it is.
One of my favorites, actually.
Yeah.
I just wanted to come back as well to I was talking there about the way a lot of people look at MPE through the current system and they can't quite envision how it's going to work out.
It's the same thing without interest and a schedule of payment that's a lot slower because it relates to the lifespan. That's the only difference. That's it.
Yeah.
You don't have a bank. Instead of a bank, you've got what we call a common monetary infrastructure. It doesn't charge you interest. It's just going to issue a representation of your promissory obligation. Gets banking out of the equation. And instead of paying a house off in 20 years when that house lasts 100 years and you haven't consumed of it in the 20 years, you pay for it over the 100 years that it gets consumed. So if you occupy it for 40 years, you pay for those 40 years of its lifespan, and whatever's left.
You basically pay for what you consume.
Right.
As you consume of it.
Right.
With an equal measure of your production.
Right. Exactly.
No, but what I was trying to say is that a lot of the questions that arise as well, I'm just being honest here, folks, they're arising because you don't understand the whole aspects of MPE. Like, for example, a lot of people, saying, oh, what about greed and theft and, and people, trying to...
What about them?
Yeah.
What they're doing is, if you ask a question like that, what about greed? You're refusing to do any of your own thinking. Where does greed fit in? Greed fits in when you're a bank. You've got all this money, and it has to be spent in order for it to get back into circulation. Some of it at least has to be spent, and that's the intention of defrauding people of their own production. Now, so what do you do with it? If you're a banker, your principle is a breach of the only principles which serve us. You're actually after unearned taking. You're after taking all you can without producing anything. That's the ultimate objective of what we call capitalism. Capitalism is not free enterprise. So what do? You buy things and withhold them from markets. You control prices in distribution chains. You dictate the price of beef. The price that people will pay is determined by the price that you want for controlling the distribution system. You take charge of all of these things which are positions from which you can exploit the people further, because that's all you're about. You're not about giving just services or production for just prices. You're after the most you can get from whatever ultimate set of victims you impose yourself upon for the least that you can give. That's greed. Now, when you have a monetary system that multiplies debt upon us, what happens? Everyone has to make up for an escalating deficiency in their standard of life. So we're all forced to take up greed against each other. We cannibalize each other in order just to tread water. There could be 1,000 people drowning in a pool, and a banker will run across their heads just to get to the other side. Why? Because it's about surviving the obfuscation of the currency itself. Now you say, what about greed? As if, there's no solution for greed. Well, you can't solve greed until you get greed out of the money. You see, there might still be greed, but suppose, for instance, you have a situation where a bank, let's say construction contractors cannot make a living under this currency any longer. So what happens? Investors, so-called, who are tied to the purse strings of bankers, they invest in all this property off in the desert somewhere, and they level it, and they start building basically, let's say, a retirement community, for example, and just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of houses. Far more than any construction contractor could ever finance in this day of age. Why? Because they're tied to the purse strings of the bankers, because they're actually employed to spend some of the takings of the banking system in such a way. So then these houses are sold for far more than what they ought to be. The construction crews, and I'm thinking of actual real world examples, I'm thinking of an exact place where this happened. The construction crews, no denigration to Mexicans, they're hardworking people. I always had good relationships with Mexicans, but they hire Mexicans who are not carpenters to do carpenters' work, and Mexicans will do any kind of work. I mean, Mexicans are hardworking people, but they pay these guys. They're illegal aliens. They're paid way under. They're paid substandard wages for their work. They're not even provided tools, and toward the end of the construction job, as the housing crisis, precipitates upon us, they don't even pay these people. So what do they have to do? They have to leave the country, go back to Mexico again. They got screwed by the bankers. Yeah, you have greed. You have greed. But why do you have greed? Because construction contractors can't make it here any longer, because bankers are prevailing in this management of resources and labor, and because they're corrupt people, and they just they leave us all stranded however they will. It's all about taking for nothing. You see, until you get out of that out of the equation, though, so that these people aren't empowered to do these things, and until we're not after staying ahead of a declining currency ourselves, we're set against each other. And it isn't just greed that you have to be concerned about. It's a fact that we're racing, a currency that's imposing terminal failure upon us, and we're trying to make money however we can. This is why people are advocating gold. They don't understand that gold's a solution, and they're hoping that the price of gold just continues to go up so that somehow they can tread water against this escalating tide of indebtedness that's washing us all out to sea. What about greed? That's just a mindless question. You have to say, okay, well, what are the conditions we have, and how do they precipitate in greed? Now, how would this other proposition, mathematically perfected economy, precipitate in greed? Well, let's just say, for example, all the houses that are bought, some person, a banker type, decides, well, I'll just assume a promissory obligation for 1,000 houses, and I'll charge these people 10% more for each house. Okay, and so there you have greed, these people say. Why is that going to happen under mathematically perfected economy? It wouldn't happen under mathematically perfected economy. Why? Because we're eradicating exploitation. The mandate eradicates exploitation. Unearned taking is basically no longer legal. It's even a serious crime. But this person is obviously not consuming houses, doesn't need to own them, is only going to own them. So by depriving the market of the availability of the houses, they can acquire this 10% higher price and thus make an unearned profit. Unearned profit is illegal. So that's how you eradicate exploitation or greed. You have to have a way of sustaining ourselves. So a person can't just buy all of the rice production to artificially withhold rice and increase its price. Why? Because the only thing we're allowing each other to charge, basically by our standards of creditworthiness itself, the only thing we're allowing ourselves to charge for is our contribution to the overall pool of wealth. A trucker moves products from one place to another. A train does the same kinds of things. Distribution centers may warehouse things for a while until they go directly into the supply chain at retail stores. Anything that's necessary that imposes costs which are necessary to preserve a product as long as it needs to be preserved until it enters the market, that is and becomes consumed. Any of those things which are legitimate, we will not only monetize but need to sustain. But to purchase all these things merely to make unnecessary, unwarranted profit for which exceeds whatever we've contributed to the overall pool of wealth, is something that we have to eradicate. Now, if you're raising your arms and you're saying, "What about greed?" You should instead be saying, "Well, that's the solution. Obviously, we have to do that." Instead, you're sitting there and saying, "What about greed?" when the only solution to greed was just given to you, and you're sitting there saying, "What about greed?" Well, great. What about I have to go to the bathroom?
Yeah, and
I
another
mean,
thing that
that's
was
just, I'm
mentioned.
sorry, that's mindlessness.
Mm,
I mean, if you're asking the guy who's eliminating greed to what about greed, when you just got the answer for eliminating greed, you're not even thinking. And
mm,
it's not just automatic that mathematically perfected economy eliminates greed. It is the principles which eliminate greed. But if you don't do it correctly, you'll suffer greed. If you allow that guy who wants to buy every house in the world just to withhold all houses from all people, and somebody over there says, "Okay, I've got to buy a house," and this guy says, "Well, there's all the houses, take your pick," and it should be
mm,
$1,000 a year or $83.33 a month under mathematically perfected economy to the real creditor who produced the house. But this guy who just assumed the promissory obligation wants, instead of $100,000, he wants $110,000. So your payments go up $8.33, over $83.33, and so you've got $92 a month payments, and you think, "Oh, fine, it's only $10 more." Well, then you're responsible for admitting exploitation or greed into the system. You have to say, "No, no, no, that's only $10 a month." It ends up at $10,000 per house. We had 1,000 houses, times 10, $1,000. That's a pile of money for nothing that's costing us. But worse, we've breached a principle. Who's to say the next guy isn't going to want $20 a month, and the next guy wants 40, and the next guy wants 80, and you've doubled the cost of houses just because you were willing to make a little compromise and say, well, let's not be responsible. Let's not hold our CMI accountable for eradicating exploitation. What's the cost of a house? It's what the producer produces it for, and that's their price. It can never go above that. And mathematically perfected economy prevents it from going above that because it never finances anything for more than its remaining value, which is based on its original value less depreciation or consumption over its lifespan. You see? So mathematically perfected economy eradicates greed. And if we don't understand that, then we're paving the way for greed, because what do we have in lieu of understanding and deciding on the only thing that eradicates greed? We have greed. We not only have greed, we have terminal greed.
Yeah. And what was I going to say? So the principles that you mentioned there, because people they don't know what the principles are, and that's why all these questions arise. And then because you have those questions and you can't work it out because you don't know what the principles are. So it's like a closed circuit, and then you're trying to poke holes in the system without actually even understanding how the system works.
Well, people who are asking questions as if there can't be a solution, they're not part of the solution. They should stay where they are and pay interest and lose their homes. The rest of us can't wait for that. That's why I've wasted 44 years on this. It's the people who don't want to understand. There's nobody out here that can't understand that. As we said, earlier, you said, a child understands what the nature of a promissory obligation is. If they loaned 5 marbles to a friend and that friend was supposed to give them back their 5 marbles after they played some game, the onus is on that friend to give back those 5 marbles. And when they do give them back, the debt is fulfilled. If they had a piece of paper that was worth the 5 marbles that were supposed to be returned, when the 5 marbles are returned, that piece of paper is null and void. That's
Burned,
it. So why don't you understand that principle? Because you never listened to it in the first place. So what are you watching the show for? All you're asking is for us to go around in circles again. It's already been explained. The principles are simple. What you want is you want to trade an equal volume of your production for someone else's production. Why would you ever want to give more, especially to someone else that neither party, the one that receives from you or the one that you give to or owes you a debt, if neither of you, the creditor or the obligor, receive anything from this other party, why would you want to give anything to them? Nobody has a good reason for that. Why don't you understand the principle then? When you trade something, you want to trade an equal volume of your production for whatever production you're acquiring. And yes, we can arrange for you to pay for it over time, because if we award the real creditor a promissory obligation in full payment, then the only remaining matter is that you pay for whatever you received as you consume of it, because that maintains a circulation which allows them forever, however long they hold that payment that they got, full payment, they can spend it for an equal volume of production. You see? And that's it. The principles are simple. We're maintaining a circulation which equals the remaining value of represented property because we're paying for the property as we consume of it. If you have a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan, the first year of the life of the home, at a linear rate, you consume $1,000 of its value. You've also paid $1,000 against it because you're paying for it as you consume of it. So $99,000 of value remain and $99,000 of circulation remain. Every one of those dollars equals the same part of that house that it originally did. The same part of the house being the part of its lifespan or remaining ability to consume it. You see? So the next year you pay another $1,000. And guess what? It's 98 years of lifespan remaining, $98,000 of obligation remain to pay, and $98,000 of circulation remain, enabling you to pay for it with an equal amount of circulation. You can always pay all the debts out of the circulation that exists because it's exactly equal to the remaining debts at all times. And the whole reason is because you're paying for the debts as you consume them. There's not a lot to master that. If anybody doesn't understand that, they haven't even made a worthy effort.
Yeah. Another thing I want to mention, this is a common question that usually come up, and just if you just allow me, Mike, just to address that,
Sure.
And then you can comment as well. Why do we still not have MPE? Well, I think it's simple because we don't have people who understand MPE, and the only people who can implement MPE are actual people who understand it. If you don't understand it and you're waiting for somebody like Mike or somebody else to implement it, then it's not going to happen. And the reason why is all around us. We don't understand this and wait for somebody.
We are the
waiting
reason.
for
If we don't understand it, we are the reason. You know, if you want to vote for Ron Paul and
reflection,
go ahead.
What we have at the moment is reflection of the state, the exact reflection of the state of how many people understand MPE.
Right.
And when you do understand, when you understand it, you will understand what we mean by that.
Suppose I'm killed tonight, for instance. Well, persons such as yourself have understood this, and you and Vin and others may prevail in establishing mathematically perfected economy, but only because you keep trying to explain the same things to people who don't want to get off their butts and say, this is my first algebra lesson. I have to master it because I can't do my second lesson if I never will. As Edith Hamilton said, when the freedom they desired most was a freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and never was free again. You've abandoned the principles of freedom and justice, and that's why you don't have them. That's why a few people could deny them to us, and we quiver in fear and have no way of standing up against them. We say, oh, money's created out of thin air, or the debts don't exist, or the interest didn't exist to pay the debt, therefore we can't pay the debt, therefore no debt exists. None of this even makes sense. All we want is what doesn't even make sense. And if we can't wake up, then what we're really going through is a waste of time here, where history is culling the people, and there's good people that are going to go away as well, but they're culling the people who can't even get off their arses and do anything about their own fate. Because instead of uniting over a fact of solution, they think, oh, well, let's go do another awful bank, or let's do another currency. And this one's based on gypsum. And another one that's based on antlers, and I have another one that's based on canvas, and I have another currency that's based on discarded wood and garbage, because it all has to be recycled, and that somehow equals the amount of money that we have. But we just say that, we don't explain how. We explain how, and you say it's too complicated, and it's just a few damn points.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do you want to stick to the outline that we started with, or what do you want to do? I mean, I know you ran through that, but I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing there's different people in the chat box. Some
Well, does anybody have any good questions that aren't obvious to answer?
Do you want to maybe? Would you want to take calls now, or do you want to just?
Well, I'd take a call if anybody wants to call.
Okay, so free for all. Do you want to give your Skype then? Which one people should call into?
Yeah, it might be kind of hard to do this because I don't have a separate computer set up to it. People are going to have to add me to their Skype contacts.
Yeah.
But you can You can do that. It's M_Montagne. I'm about to spell it out. So that's all lowercase M_Montagne. You can add me to your Skype contacts. So I'll watch it here if anybody wants to do that, and um, you can call in a question or type it in the chat box there. Um, you know, this is about eradicating greed. You know, I have a lot of Native American friends. In fact, I interviewed a friend last night for a future show, and I think about these things often in Native American terms because Native Americans have a they teach their young, and they have oral traditions of teaching which are really important to preserving all of the important knowledges, not just some of them, but all of them. And they take a responsibility in these things. And so I often talk to my Native American friends about these kinds of issues, and I mean they just shake their heads about I mean I'm of Scottish and Irish descent, and so I'm a European, and rightly so. I don't take any offense to that. And I mean, John told me last night that he'd gladly, pay my way back home, to Europe. It's just a joke, but they shake their heads at us because we impose all these problems upon ourselves. We have all around us, we have the technological wherewithal to solve far more difficult problems. This obfuscation of our currency, the fact that banking is terminal, the fact that it has one and one only solution is in truth a technologically simple problem, and yet here we are, the very victims of it, and we're arguing like, oh, well, what about greed? As if we can't do this because greed will somehow still exist. We have to take the attitude of solving all these things. If we don't want greed, we have to find the way to eradicate greed, and take a step yourself and think this out and see how you would do that. Understand that this circulation of this obfuscation indeed compels us to cannibalize each other, to attack each other, to take up greed ourselves, to try and get the most for whatever it is we do, as opposed to a just price. When you allow something to push all of us that direction, you're going to have a mountain of greed, Now, if you eradicate that one thing that pushes all of us to participate in greed and to exacerbate greed, you eliminate that, well, you're going to have a new world. Does that automatically mean greed goes away? Well, it would go away automatically if our common monetary infrastructure will never finance anything for more than the producer produced it for, what was the original price. That right there eliminates greed. Why? Because anyone who buys it downrange only takes over the remaining life of the promissory obligation. There's no opportunity for greed, you see. So just think a little bit. Now that might be a little bit hard to grasp because people, I don't know what happens to them. They don't pay any attention. All these words just go in one ear and out the other, and whatever. I have no idea what it is, but how can you have greed under mathematically perfected economy? Let me throw your question back at you. If a lot of people are asking that, how could you possibly have greed if nothing can be financed for any more than the original price of the production which the original buyer agrees to consume of it, less the consumption which has been paid for over the lifespan? If you'll never finance anything for more than that, which is to just take over a promissory obligation, where's the opportunity for greed? Somebody type that in the chat room, and Ivan will see it, and we'll answer to it. But just imagine, where is the opportunity for greed? Turn it around. Your question is negative. You don't believe that this solves it. Okay, fine. Where is the opportunity even for greed?
No reply so far.
Well, I don't have anybody phoning in either.
No, but I'm just talking about the greed part. No reply.
Uh-huh.
I'm just scanning through the chat box here. Okay, well, you know the official offer process, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just checking
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you know what I mean, yeah.
Yeah. That doesn't
Now,
solve
why?
things. It's a temporary thing
Exactly.
now.
And just what I'm trying to say is, yes, we can all use the official offer, and yes, it will slow down the whole thing to a halt, but then we have to fix it.
Right.
Who's going to fix it if it's not us?
And if we
And
don't
if
know
it
how
is
to
us,
fix it,
if it is us, exactly, if it is us, we have to know how to fix it. And everybody have to know how to fix it, or at least a crucial amount of people have to know how to fix it, because if there isn't this crucial amount of people, then how do you expect the majority of people to join you if you can't even explain it to your local community?
yeah, if you're
how to
talking
fix
about
it?
all this
So
baloney, such as money is created out of thin air. You bought a $100,000 house. You signed a contract to pay $100,000 for the house. Today you paid $110,000 in interest and principal. How much do you owe on that house? Zero. You've overpaid $10,000 to some SOBs who just printed further representations of your promissory obligation. You've paid $90,000 in interest and principal. How much do you owe? $10,000. Or so. There's 10 years of remaining lifespan is when you of a 100-year remaining lifespan is where you begin to pay, and you paid that $90,000 over 7.5 years. Divide 7.5 years from or subtract 7.5 years from 90, and that's how long into the future it is before you have to make another payment against that debt. Why? Because you paid until that moment in time against that house. So 82.5 years from now, you'll make your first payment, and instead of being $1,000 a month, it's $83.33, 1/12 as much, and that's hard for you to get your brain around.
Yeah, I'm just typing here in the chat box. Again, I know you know if somebody is under, like, he's just coming across this information, and the banks and solicitors and everybody knocking on the doors and the sheriffs and everything. What I would say, and I'm sure Mike you would agree, go ahead and use the official offer. It's a straightaway plaster that takes a lot of headache away. But if we all use it and then we look at each other and waiting for the other person to learn MPE, well, nothing's going to happen, folks.
Yeah, I wouldn't even bother with the official offer myself. I would claim the arguments of this mandate. Resolve your debt. I would offer to resolve the falsified debt in like manner and kind. I would issue an irredeemable promise to pay for the full balance, including any prepayment penalties or whatever, and I would have that witnessed. You see?
Yeah.
And I would force the bank to take me to court, and the mandate would be your arguments. You don't even have to master them, but you do need to know what they generally are. You can't go in there and claim there is no debt, or that money's created out of thin air, or you can't pay the interest because the interest doesn't exist. The judge is going to know better, because the judge is accustomed to thinking. He's accustomed to searching for the answer that we call justice. And if we don't have it and he doesn't have it, you go to court and you're banking then for him to determine it without you providing the case for it. That's a long hope, regardless how good a person that judge may be. You see, all judges aren't bad, but when you go to court and you can prove a case that is irrefutable, in your behalf, you see, having such a document to rely on, and so on and so forth. You have a case that theoretically cannot be denied you unless the judge is so bad that he can decide against you even when the facts stack up on your side and your side alone. But, if you just want to sit there and think, what about greed? As if that implies something. What about greed? How many people that ask a question like that even attempt to answer it themselves? I mean, I'm sure we've already answered it many times in many programs in many ways, But just think, we've gone through this. If you're following along, I mean, there's two ways that we think we understand things, and one is we just memorize whatever is said. So when we're taught the Pythagorean theorem, we just presume that it's true that the sum of the squares of the two sides of a right triangle equal the square of the hypotenuse. But we don't understand that unless we can prove it ourselves. Now that's not a difficult thing when you're talking about elementary, incontrovertible, fundamental mathematics, addition and subtraction, in which a circulation remains sufficient to resolve all debt, to pay for all debt, exactly what the remaining value of the property is. I mean, you can't find a flaw in it, and you just sit there and go, well, there must be something wrong with it, so let's ask a question. What about greed? Or what about the color of the money? Or what about how big the bills are? Does that make any difference? That you're not even thinking if, I don't.
Mike, let's. I would like to make an official offer, just from myself, and maybe you would like to hop on board. We have on Skype the groups set up, right? We have the two groups basically, where we have general discussion with people interested in MPE, and we have the insiders, where we have a lot of people that are actually considering using MPE in courts. So here's an official offer of MPE. You give me a shout on Skype. Skype name is Ivan.tnsradio, and you just had the mics. You have the mic. Or actually, don't bother Mike. Just give me a shout because Mike is working on the mandate. If you really have to bother Mike, it's _.
I'm not really working on the mandate. I'm actually helping so many. I don't even have time to work on the website. The mandate's finished.
Yeah, which is another reason why we all have to understand this, so we're able to help Mike. But what I'm trying to say is, this can be like immediate. You can use it immediately. It doesn't take rocket scientists to understand that. Like we said, it's if somebody wants to understand this and you're facing foreclosure, give me a shout. Ivan.tnsradio. Give Mike a shout. We'll add you to the groups. We have other people who understand this. It's not just me, Mike, and Vin.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is you don't have any other alternative. Yeah. And in fact, there would be a good question. Suppose you just don't buy this. Somehow you're just stuck. You got one wheel in this rut, and wherever that rut goes, you're going with it. And the rut is that you believe money is created out of thin air, so there's no debt. Whatever we've explained already just went out the other ear. None of it was assimilated. Doesn't mean anything to you. So you intend to argue that there is no debt. All right, fine. Come into our group, and in other words, Skype Ivan. I'll add you to the group for MPE general discussion. Give us your arguments for your defense, and we'll defeat them for you. We'll show you what you're up against in a court which is going to determine justice. If you want to assert that you can't pay the interest because it didn't exist in circulation, or that money has to be resource based, or what about greed? Whatever, we'll defeat it, because we've already answered all these questions, countless times, and I don't know. It blows my mind that people think they actually mean something when they mindlessly repeat such mindless dogma as money is created out of thin air. No one in their right mind would dream that money is created out of thin air. And the phrase actually implies that we're suffering circulatory inflation, and the people that claim we are just talking about the money that's coming into circulation, not even accounting for what we're paying out. And somehow that results in a profusion of money, an excess of circulation. When I was 16, I asked my teacher, I says, well, how is it even possible, given that the debts are collateralized, how is it even possible to suffer circulatory inflation? And my teacher, who was an economist, thought for minutes and finally says, by God, I think you're right. That was 44 years ago, and nobody's proven that wrong. Does a question exist that we have circulatory inflation? Are we actually suffering these problems because we have an excess of money? Your wallet's overflowing? That's why prices are going up? You have more money than you ever had in your life, and yet the prices have just gone up more than the money has gone up, which was more money than you ever had before in your life? It's not true at all. No one has any money. That's why people can't even buy things from each other at rock bottom prices. That's why people are living in their businesses for a while before their business goes down. I mean, it's a lack of money under a terminal sum of falsified indebtedness, which can only escalate all the further. That's our problem. And that isn't money's been created out of thin air. Yes, more money's being created than ever before, but that's because we're paying more out of circulation than ever before, because our debts are greater than they've ever been before. And is the net result an excess of money? Absolutely not. It is stupid. It is utterly stupid to say that money is created out of thin air.
Yeah. So there's still nobody calling in. I just want to add actually something. I was in Dublin the other weekend, and I've made it quite, public, both on the chat and in the groups. By the way, folks, there's a group meetup in Dublin, so if you can make it to Art Gillen, you can meet with with people in the Dublin group. So I've made it quite clear. Everybody knew that I'm going to be in Dublin that weekend, and if you want to understand MPE, I'll be covering MPE. And do you know how many people showed up? 2 people.
2 people. Yeah.
Yes. And then I understand some people maybe couldn't make it, but then again, I told everybody that I'll be happy to explain MPE on TNS. Do you know how many people contacted me to, added me on Skype? 1, 2, 3, 4 people.
Yeah.
So people were saying after your broadcast, they don't understand this. And I said, I'll post a forum discussion where I will be explaining how to, all the crucial bits that you need if you really want to get your head around this. Mm-hmm. How many people participated in the discussion or how many views there were? Under 100.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening? What do you need, a private instructor, or do you need somebody to sit with you? And I don't mind sitting with somebody who's trying to understand this. And this is another thing that I hope all the people who are trying to let's just say with not such honest intentions for whatever reasons they have, if you post if you offer questions about MPE, we can actually know when the person who is posing them does not really understand, really haven't looked into MPE. This is what I've commented. That when, like, for example, if you go fishing with somebody or you're doing something with somebody who knows his onions, you can't just pretend to understand. And that's why everybody like me, Mike, and Vin, and people who really get this, they will see through it. The questions that you
as a
ask
judge will in court.
gives you away, and judge as well. Yeah, exactly. So if you want to, waste my time and waste Mike's time, go ahead, but don't be surprised if we're just ignoring you, because I do that. I just ignore people that, they post these questions, and I can see it straight away that it's all the question is not to understand it. The question is just to trying to poke holes and
They don't
use
really
the
want a
MPE.
solution. They just want entertained for a while or something, you know. But at the same time, the thing about it is we can relate to what happens in the chat room, and we think it's representative, but it's really not the case. I can say, like, since the debate with, Lawful Bank, for instance, that I received a profusion of positive reaction to that. And in fact, I had a great discussion yesterday with Chris McClellan of Scotland, and I've never talked to Chris before. You add him to our MPE general discussion group. I just thought, since you said he was from TNS, that I'd call him and meet him, and we talked for over 5 hours. And I was amazed, how well he understood it, and he was against it at first. He said it was his fault. He, wasn't paying attention. He was convinced that gold was our solution, until one day he just ended up paying careful attention to a whole show. And he realized, holy cow, it is the answer, and it is the only answer. There can't be two answers to a mathematic riddle. There's one solution to inflation and deflation. There's one solution to systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, and there's one solution to inherent, irreversible, and terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. And it isn't to introduce the interest with the principal, as Ellen Hodgson Brown, the pretender, says. There's one solution to those things. It's not difficult to see that. I mean, the fact that, there's one solution to any mathematic riddle is enough to make people think, well, all right, he's reduced it to three things there. Are those the only three things? And is mathematically perfected economy the only solution? That isn't a difficult problem to resolve. If we're the kind of people who solve problems, it's a routine matter. And we're trying. I don't know what's going to, turn some people, but loss of all their property. They'll wait till the last moment. They'll wait till they have to go to court that day. But you better not wait until after you've already gone to court and you told the judge you don't believe there's a debt, even though you signed a contract to assume a debt, and that contract was to pay the principal. That's what the contract was. It subjected it to interest, but you subjected to interest thinking that the bank was loaning you money. But it had to create the money, or it had to loan you money that wasn't the bank's. Not rightfully the bank's, because interest isn't warranted, because the first money that came into circulation never was evidence of rightful entitlement or property of the banking system. So if we don't want to understand that, we can't solve our problems, and we're unfit to govern ourselves.
Yeah, and govern ourselves, another word for that would be sovereign.
That's one word for it. I saw something disturbing here, flicking through the channels to get things straight. I heard sovereign, and I stopped, and it was an Alaskan. It was about police in Alaska enforcing laws in Alaska, and they're going after some guy who claimed to be a sovereign and a constitutionalist, and he's probably just an elderly pot dealer, but because he was a sovereign, he was claiming sovereignty. They called 4 backup units, you know, and I mean, this has become a bad word, and it's very unfortunate because it's the word that we need. But pretenders, you can't be sovereign and insist upon injustice, because injustice it only manifests in injustice, or if it's a crime against someone else. Sovereignty isn't about just deciding how you want things to be for you. It's deciding about how they have to be for everyone, so we can live lives that don't impose injustice upon anyone else. And it's just that. If you have a bunch of people who are claiming sovereignty to protect themselves from debts that they've assumed, and they're misusing all these terms, all you have is giving sovereignty a bad name. It's just like what people are doing when they claim there's no debt, or money's created out of thin air, or you can't pay the interest because the interest doesn't exist. All they do is give monetary reform a bad name. Yep. And these guys went with major force. This guy was so old and decrepit, he couldn't even get into the police car, just to stoop a little bit and get his butt on the seat and get in the door was too much. The guy had virtual zero physical activity for way too long, and they went with all this backup against this guy because he was a sovereign. Think about it. We have to make sovereignty the right thing, and this isn't about pretenders taking off in every tack and whim that they want. It's not about militarism. It's not about monetary reform isn't about whatever we want to say to purportedly simplify the real facts into something that isn't a fact at all. You have to understand the real fact to simplify it, and if anybody could simplify it more than I already had and still be accurate, they would have. And I've been, I just I was going to send Ivan just the records that I have on Roger Hayes are 862 megabytes. That's just what I have on Roger Hayes. And I have thousands and thousands and thousands of plagiarists, records of thousands and thousands and thousands of plagiarists. Roger Hayes.
I'm sure he pleased you following what he's doing.
That's what he said. But it's not as if I've got a great amount of time to do this. What'll happen is somebody will post me that they changed their pages or something like that. Originally, those pages were, obviously, and Roger would deny this. He would interrupt me and not even let me continue, as he did with everything. But the original proposition was they didn't know what the bank would be, but they wanted to see if there was any interest in it, and that you could buy or open a branch of the bank and share in its profits. That's a multi-level marketing scheme. That's what it was. That was the original idea. And as that's proven unpalatable, what has he done? He's glanced at my work, and he's morphed it in more and more into mathematically perfected economy, as if a private bank should be our CMI, which is absolutely not so. In fact, some of the material that I was about to send you is a video of Roger presenting to a modest audience of 20 or 30 people who actually understand the monetary issues better than he does. He says at one point, well, if you want to understand, they challenge him on his very poor explanation of money. He stands in front of these people and he said he could just write out some money on a piece of paper and that would be as good as the money that's created, which isn't exactly creating money out of thin air. It's creating something of falsified value, which is irredeemable. Okay, so it's at least that. It's not thin air. It's on a piece of paper. It's not air. It's a piece of paper, and it purports to be something which is unenforceable, which is falsified, and therefore it's a falsified contract, a breach of trust. So he's advocating a breach of trust is as legitimate as this money, and that's exactly what he's proposing to do in this bank. You see? Now, so somebody in the audience challenges him on that, and so what does he do? Instead of answering their questions, he defers them and he says, well, if you really want to understand about money, watch the video Money as Debt, which is another plagiarist, Paul Green, who so misunderstands the issues that he assumes debt's the problem rather than interest multiplying falsified debt into terminal debt. And terminal debt is the problem, but he waited until it was terminal debt before he ever stood up against it. And what is Paul Green but an artist who has on the side he produces cartoon videos, and all of a sudden he's a monetary reformist, stealing my work, not giving it credit. He's got a link on my sites. He says that's credit. He won't answer me. He won't answer the telephone. He won't answer telephone messages left. He won't answer emails. Why is that? Because he has zero integrity. Because he's making a pile of money off my work, promoting a misunderstanding of it that debt is the problem, when without the ability to assume promissory obligations, a newlywed couple can't afford a brand new home that they can't afford if we allow them to assume a promissory obligation, which is an obligation to pay for the home as they consume of it. So we cast them out of the home, we submit them to greed, the thing that you're against. And what happens when they're submitted to greed? A landlord who can't own the home charges them the highest price that they can pay. They can never save the money to own a home in their entire life. And we're not doing that because maybe greed isn't eradicated by mathematically perfected economy, though I just explained how, and probably that went in one ear and out the other as well.
Yeah. Mike, I think some of the guys wanted to call in. I don't know if you need to add them before they call in or not. Maybe just check on your Skype, see if anybody added you.
I gave up on that, and sorry for that. My screen is gone blank. I'm not seeing that. Let's see. Mike D. Fish I got here. So I'm going to add Mike. That's the only one I've got.
Right. So,
okay, so now I'm going to try and add him to the conversation here. 1 second, Mike. I'll get right with you here. Excuse me, scrolling through these takes a while. All right. So we're ringing Mike here. Hey there, Mike.
Hey there, Mike. How are you?
Doing good. Thanks for calling in.
Good. I haven't been listening for too long, but I'm just catching in on what you're talking about.
All right.
So, I am interested in it now. I must sit down one night and watch your video on YouTube, The Mathematically Perfected Economy. I've yet to watch it. Entirely me on board, but I will watch it so I'll get a better understanding of what you're talking about. But it's a brilliant idea if it can ever get off the ground.
It will get off the ground. It's we're a little bit stymied. I mean, if there is some blame that falls on me, and there is, it's this. I don't have staff. I've got a lot of people around me, an expanding circle of people who are handling a lot of issues. But the attention that I have to give to the people that I do, bringing new people into our circles, ever-expanding circles and all, is such that it's taking all of my time. And I really need to dedicate full time to finishing this website and the minimal material. I mean, I haven't typed but a few characters into several articles for weeks now, because that's the weight of the demands upon me. I mean, I'm talking to people all over the world all day long. the radio is important because even though there's a lot of negative stuff that goes on in the chat rooms and whatnot, Mike, I mean, there's good people too. And in fact, I just had fantastic discussions with people yesterday and for several days. And I'd actually say, although for most of 40 years, most of the feedback is just negative and vicious and all, which is just ridiculous. But it's actually
down to ignorance, though.
Pardon?
The negative feedback just comes down to ignorance, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, it does. And
I mean, what you're proposing with MMO, I mean, or MME, it's a perfectly good way for people to live, for society to be. Do you know what I mean? But like King was saying there, Ivan, there's too much greed.
Right.
But you need to eliminate greed, and that's the tough part, I suppose.
Well, the greed is the greed is in jeopardy today. We think that these bankers can't understand this, or that they know that they're doing this. It's really not true.
But see, it's not about money though with them, you see. It's about control, you know what I mean? That's what people need to realise, that this has nothing to do with money, what's going on in the world at the moment. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with money.
Well, it does, though.
At the end of the day,
It's about money and wealth, because they're the reward for control. The control's necessary so that they can persist in the exploitation. That's what
I mean. That's the only reason money exists. It's there to exploit everybody else.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Because everyone is in the
Can I just jump in there? Mike, how's it going, by the way? I've spoken to you before.
Yeah,
good.
Yeah.
I just wanna jump in there real quick and say that I think there must have been something that came first. I don't think that we have the control thing inherent, and I do believe that if you look into MPE more deeply, Mike, you will actually find out that you will find out what is the egg and what is the chicken. The money is what brings on the need for control.
I haven't sat and watched all of Mike's videos, so I will admit that straight off the bat.
If you will, you would see how much the actual control grid that we have around us is in effect, is the result. It's not the cause. The cause it goes far beyond that. Because we had. It's not something new that was invented recently. The control, it's always been there.
Right, and it's
money.
What's that, Mike?
I mean, that's what I was saying to Mike there was that like all this money issue, like control is what came before money. You know what I mean? Long before money was ever invented.
No, I'm saying it's the other way around. Let's just give an example. And the example is the Second Gulf War. Weapons of mass destruction were alleged. Even when they were first alleged, we had reports from intelligence people and whatnot that those claims were falsified, that Bush knew better. We invaded Iraq, but why did we invade Iraq? Saddam Hussein intended to create what's called an oil bourse. He was going to cease trading oil in dollars. Why? Yeah. He held a lot of dollars, and so his wealth or entitlement was at stake because the value of the dollar could have been destroyed. He was a smart guy in the fact that he wanted to get out from under the dollar. He was the first one, basically, to get out.
Assad is at the same thing now.
Pardon me?
Assad in Syria. Do you think he's at the same thing?
I don't know that much about that. I would hesitate to say.
You see what's going on there. You just watch like CNN or Sky News over here in Ireland, and you see the bullshit that they're spewing out about Syria. But you believe it or not, is another thing. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion of what's going on out there.
Well, money's at the core of a lot of it, and let's just finish this thing with Saddam Hussein. So that's when they took him out. But so we would think that might be a reason that we at least have to evaluate is the possible cause. But then, if you follow the events, they struggled for months and months and months and months before they even began to form a government. And long before they even make the first inroads to that, they had a central bank.
Yeah.
You see, the chicken and the egg, which is which?
That was the first thing they done in Libya. The first thing so-called rebels or whatever you want to call them. You know,
Libya and Egypt, yep, you have the same
yeah,
problems.
the first thing they done was set up a central bank. That was the very first thing.
And why were all those protests? They were protesting against loss of employment. They were protesting against a degenerating economy. They were protesting against the loss of prosperity. You know, so it's
in Libya. You mean?
Pardon me?
You mean in Libya?
In Libya, I think it's probably a little different situation.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think in Libya it's probably a little different situation.
I've never been. I mean, I've seen videos on YouTube about Libya. I've read stuff online about Libya. That
well,
it was apparently a great place to live. That our employment was high, that housing was high, that the standard of living was very high compared to the rest of Africa.
Well, I wouldn't say that you know what they did to that. You know, one gal was so good. You know. I don't think, you know, Gaddafi was any kind of a saint. What they were doing, while it might have had great advantages in a sort of a socialistic type of state as compared to what we would want to have in a free state, nonetheless, he didn't have a monetary solution. Much of the wealth of Libya would have to be due to their oil, which is something that Egypt lacks and which distinguishes the two situations. So you have many things at play there. And the real solution, in truth, is a Republican form of government, unless you have to have a tribal form of government, which is what, you know, many people over there have been accustomed to for thousands of years. I mean, we could even consider the Gaddafi government as a tribal form of government because he was a leader and they just went on. I mean, it doesn't really fit the true, you know, definitions of, you know, he probably is a true dictator, but you know, in their concept, you know.
But was he though? You know what I mean? That's my question. Was he?
Well,
or was he really loved by his people?
Well, he was probably loved by some of his people, and he might have been loved very, very much by some of his people, and those some might have been a lot. We don't know.
I grew up hearing that Gaddafi's a dictator, blah, blah, blah. You know, everything you heard on the news throughout the 1980s and 1990s. But what always kept me interested in him was, my father was in the army, and he lived in Libya. He was stationed over there in Tripoli in the late 60s, early 1970s. And after the Lockerbie bombing, when all that stuff was on the news about the Lockerbie bombing, and I was saying, oh, what a terrible place Libya is, and what a horrible person Gaddafi is, you know, jumping on the bandwagon like everybody else. But I remember my father distinctly saying to me, don't believe what you're hearing on the news. He says, I lived out there, and it's nothing like what you're seeing on the news. So, you know, that's why I always had.
Well, that's the usual report of military personnel in a foreign country. You know.
No, but what he was saying is, the news was painting Gaddafi as a dictator, you know, and Libya as a rogue state and stuff like that. And he was saying it's not like that. Don't believe what you're seeing. You know.
Well, in fair. Go ahead,
Ivan. Sorry to jump in there. I was just wondering, Mike. Just in the spirit of keeping on the MPE, I was just wondering if you have any question about. No, it's okay. It's just I was wondering if you have any specific questions about MPE, perhaps maybe.
No, not at the present moment. But the next time we have the discussion, I want to watch the video first and come back in then with an educated question. You know?
Well, you know, my archives, my TNS programs, you know, you can download them from perfectedeconomy.org/FTP, and you negotiate into the single programs. You can download them all as a zip file. You know, there's 8 introductory programs. The first one covers basically everything. There's a brief program. The titles are pretty expressive of the files, that is, and you can you know, decide what you want to pick and choose from. There's, you know, my interview with Austrian economist Robert Murphy. There's you know, a variety of other, you know, interviews. you can get your brain around it. In truth, in virtually every program, we restate, what mathematically perfected economy is. Mike, I don't know if he hung up, but he dropped off offline there. Anyway, we cover the ground again and again and again. I don't, I mean, I think probably to react to people, well, we'd actually have to drag them onto the program and say, okay, you posted this. What's the problem? What wasn't explained? How does that work? Well, you're enabling greed, they might say. Well, how is that? Where did you come? In order to, what happens when you teach something? Let's just go back to school, because I tend to kind of see life this way. In school we might have, kept up with our studies. Most of us did not. I was sort of mortified from the very beginning of ever falling behind, because if you do, there's no catching up, and I could see that, and I saw it was important to keep up with my studies, if not to stay ahead, so that, the day's lecture in the class made all the more sense, and whatnot. But when we exit school and become what we call adults, we don't have any further rules than we had then. We don't have anyone to discipline us or to, instill order. We don't have anybody to teach us any further. It's up to us after that. And basically, I don't know, I think our problem is we thought we were going to be okay with what we weren't doing right a long time ago, and catching up might be, I don't know, maybe it's too far for people to go. These are simple things, but in truth, if somebody just sits in a chat room and snipes, the whole while, we don't really even know what the problem is. What about greed? Well, can answer that in a few words. We have. Should be a closed issue, but I guarantee you there's probably a whole bunch of people in the chat room who want to know about greed still. But what? Be explicit. Make a question that gives you the answer that you want. What is it you want us to explain about greed? What is it you want us to explain about the obligatory schedule of payment? Can
I just jump in there?
Sure.
Mike? The way I worked it out, and I'm sure everybody else who understood MPE probably done the same. When I had a question, I would write that down, and actually you would see that while you formulate the question, you would see the answer. You would understand it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike.
Absolutely. And you're not the only one who understood MPE that way. I've had lots of people write me. They just, they started somewhere. They didn't know where to begin. They just jumped on my homepage, which really addressed Ron Paul at the time, and how he didn't have an answer. And they think it's just talking about Ron Paul. What the problem is, they didn't realize that page was more serious than they thought. They just were looking for something about Ron Paul, and that I was opposed to him for some reason. I was discrediting him. Well, in truth, how I was discrediting that Ron Paul had any idea of what solution is at all is the same things that discredit any other proposition. I'm teaching by example, and they just assume, well, no, it relates to Ron Paul. So they didn't get it, because they weren't looking for the answer there, But then, they might tell me, like you told me, that, after a certain number of people who don't get it just go to the glossary, of terms, and at some point they look up at, they see that one exists, and then they go there to look up one term, and they see a few other terms that are interested in them. Next thing you know, they read the glossary of terms, which isn't a bad idea to start that way, but you can see from the glossary of terms how it's put together, why it's an answer for all the problems, what the problems are, because I redefine the problems, because modern economics is an attempt to conceal them from you. They call price inflation inflation, which the definition of it is circulatory inflation, an increase in circulation for goods and services. And that's the first thing I question about economics, finally, formally in class. Teacher gave us the definitions of inflation and deflation as increases or decreases in circulation for goods and services, and then claimed that inflation caused increasing prices. My hand shot into the air, and my question wasn't how that could be, because I could see how that was impossible. First of all, I said, you taught us that money comes into circulation as a debt subject to interest, and he nods his head affirmatively. And you further taught us that all the debts are collateralized, and he nods his head, my teacher nods his head affirmatively. And I said, well, first of all then, how is it even possible to suffer circulatory inflation? You've been taught a lie, all of you, and you never even questioned it. You never even asked the question that got right to the answer, and that's not hard to see. You're taught that money comes into circulation as a debt subject to interest. Okay, you have to wonder how that is. Okay, but then you're also taught that the debts are collateralized. And so what does that mean? Do you just memorize that they're collateralized and never even think about what the ramifications of that are and how that might affect anything else? You never try and fit it into reality, And then somebody tells you that circulatory inflation causes price inflation, which are my terms, circulatory inflation and price inflation. You have to distinguish between the two. Price inflation is caused by interest, and my next question to my teacher proved that, But, sitting in class and just, absorbing this as if it's all facts is, like Edith Hamilton says, when the freedom you desire most is the freedom from responsibility, then you cease to be free and you'll never be free again. You've let this deteriorate for, we had the Federal Reserve System in the United States for 100 years now. 100 years. And who's really done anything about it? You say, end the Fed, or money's created out of thin air, or you can't pay the interest, which just is a plagiarism of my work by somebody who doesn't even understand it, or money is debt, which is another plagiarism of my work by somebody who doesn't even understand it. And all this senseless stuff, we just utter this senseless stuff now, and that's going to fix things? No. We have to understand that we're not borrowing money from banks. We go there and we create the money. We give it a promissory contract which gives the money value, and then they create it as a further representation. And that creation costs them nothing, practically nothing. And yet they want us to pay all the principal to them, and they don't even consider that as profit because it's a ruse. It's an ancient ruse to steal from all of us. And how does the stealing done? By imposing interest, which multiplies all the debts. But it further multiplies the debts perpetually because we have to pay principal and interest out of a circulation that's only some of the principal. And so in order to service any of the debts that we have to keep borrowing principal back as new debt equal to the old that it otherwise would have resolved. And we're paying interest against that out of circulation and borrowing that back as new debt above the former sum of debt. So the sum of debt is increasing perpetually at an ever-escalating rate of ever greater sums of periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt until we suffer the present failure. We're the fools that allowed this to happen. We are the fools who allowed this to happen.
Yep. Exactly. So there's nobody else wants to call in. I think Patrick was saying about calling, but then he just says that he pretty much agrees with it, with the whole thing that we talked about. I just want to mention again that a lot of people that don't understand MPE, and you can actually see, like, if you look in the chat box, there's no questions about MPE, and the reason why people are unable to ask questions about MPE is, of course, because people have not looked enough into MPE to actually have a specific question. So what that should tell people who do not have questions about MPE is that you should look more deeper into MPE to actually understand it. And then when you have a question, like I said, just trying to write it down on a piece of paper and trying to, just from the fact that you're trying to formulate it, you might just get an answer.
Well, the other thing that I'm concerned about there, Ivan, is have we pounded the fundamental issues to death now, and so, is somebody tuning in and saying, well, here they go again. They're just talking about because, the chat room is stuck there. They're stuck in, first gear, and they're never going to shift into second, and they're never going to shift into third. And, we should be cruising down the highway in fourth gear by now, But we need those people to speak up and say, okay, let's talk about implementing this mandate or creating the common monetary infrastructure, the software and data warehouse that will, manage the accounts of the people of each and every country. How would you do foreign trade? We answer these things over and over again, but at least those are steps, beyond the fundamentals. If that's what people
or how you deal with defaults.
Yeah, if those are the things that people are interested in, because they haven't listened to the earlier programs where we've already covered these things. We've explained that you have to have trade balances, and of course, we've even heard our pseudoscientists, the so-called economists of our day, tell us, we can't suffer these trade imbalances forever, and indeed we can't. Our MPE General Discussion Group, which I just added Mike Fish to. Go ahead and introduce yourself there, Mike, if you will. You'll like the people that we have there. These are people who want to understand. We help each other there. And it helps to explain these things to others because it better forms the ideas in our own minds. So, it's a place where, we can help each other. But where we have to get with all this is large scale deployment of these arguments against our government. We can't start a revolution. We have to keep the peace. We can't go around destroying property because it's our property that we're destroying. We have to make the police understand our positions. We have to make the courts understand our positions. A lot of you people have judges. How come you're not talking to your, judges that are good friends? How come you're not talking to your judge friend and you don't have him interested in mathematically perfected economy, where he might call into the show or request to, that I add him to my Skype contacts and discuss these matters with us, and we could have an interesting interview with a judge, and we could see his aha moments or whatever. Attorneys, that's another thing. Government officers, I don't care what country you're in, why aren't you writing your government in Spain and saying, you have to do this. We're going to insist. We're tired of this. We're not going to allow you to do it any longer. You're on the edge of getting, charged with treason. You're guilty of treason. We should have charged you already. We are not going to lose all our property while you just sit there and do nothing. We're holding you accountable. So if you're refusing to give us mathematically perfected economy, submit to an interview with this fellow Mike Montagne on TNS radio. You debate mathematically perfected economy with him. You explain to him why you're denying it to us, why you haven't acted on this. This has been around for years. Here's a letter that I'm sending you. I'm asking for an electronic receipt for this letter to your offices. I'm proving that mathematically perfected economy has been proposed to you. People usually write me and ask me to write this, prominent politician in Greece or Italy or Spain or Portugal or England or Scotland or Ireland or Australia or South America. And, I just wrote a person in Venezuela just minutes before I went on the air. Thanks to Lewis, who's joined our MPE general discussion group here, in Venezuela. So, I just wrote a major political leader in Venezuela just minutes ago. But you people should be writing these people and saying, why don't we have mathematically perfected economy? I don't give a damn if you don't understand it yet. Have this leader ask me how it's going to prevent greed. Hold your government accountable. Say, hey, look, you just claim that we have to have austerity, but the way you're financing government can only increase the cost all the further. This guy Mike Montagne has explained this over and over, and I finally got it. And I want to know why it is that you think we should pay the ever-escalating costs, which they could have been resolved to diddly a long time ago. In fact, they've already been paid many times over, and I want to know why you're insisting that we comply with your preposterous concept of austerity, which can only bury us under an already terminal sum of debt. I want to know what you mean by austerity. How come that's the only solution? How come that's what you're advocating doing? We want to know. We demand an answer. And we don't want to hear any BS about this. We are holding you accountable. So go on the air with this guy and debate him. If you say austerity, you prove it. You tell us why it has to be austerity and how austerity can even be. You want to fight this thing. You want to prevail. Stop fighting with me. Send these people at me so that, like this discussion we had with this lawful bank the other day, that your political leaders are held accountable to the guy who can ask the questions and get the answers to expose them for what they are. Fight the battle that we can win. So these people turn tail and run, and you get what you want, which if you can't understand it yourself, you're going to have to hope that somebody else gives it to you, but do something positive for it, Hey, if it's lawful bank, all right, come on the air and prove that lawful bank is what we need. Prove how it's, if you want to just You're a friend of Roger Hayes and you want to sit there in the chat room and throw darts at me all day long, come on the air and defend lawful bank. Roger Hayes wouldn't do it. There was a bunch of people, including Vin, Ray Moore, and others, who tried to arrange a debate between Roger and I for, a year, And I spoke to Roger for the first time years ago, have it recorded, And he didn't know anything about anything. He's not solving any issues for anybody. And nobody's understanding him, because he tells you the interest doesn't exist, therefore it can't be paid. Shoot, in fact, when we borrow the interest and principal back into circulation, we're only sustaining the same circulation from which we do pay the interest until we finally suffer a terminal sum of debt which exceeds our ability to service it any longer. And then the crap hits the fan, and that's where we are right now, because the world is under a terminal sum of debt. It can only increase all the further while we pretend all these things that can't save us might. We can create some jobs that are going to disappear, so on and so forth. Everywhere in the world, our political candidates for president right now are just unbelievably inept and out of touch with reality. And so it is around the world. Is there another country where a major leader is standing up for a solution? No. And if there is a solution, what is it? Is there an alternate solution for inflation and deflation? Absolutely not. If you think there is, get on the air and debate it with me. Prove there's an alternate solution for inflation and deflation. Then, to maintain a circulation which always equals represented property, owing to the fact that we pay for the property and no more at the rate of consumption of the related property, retiring principal, therefore, at that rate. That itself is a proof that the only vehicle for a rightful economy is the promissory obligation, and the only schedule of payment is the obligatory schedule of payment of mathematically perfected economy. One solution for inflation and deflation. How many solutions are there for inherent, irreversible, and terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest, unwarranted interest, unjustified interest, unjustifiable interest? Well, because interest is unjustifiable, the only solution for terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest is to eradicate interest. So there's one solution there too. And we had a third category for it, which I usually give second, is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. And what is that? It's a combination of the first and third faults. And since we've already solved them, we've already solved it. So that's it. Mathematically perfected economy is an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment. Period. Should be the end of discussion. And we're saying, what about grade? And we're not writing our leaders saying, how come you're not doing mathematically perfected economy? How come you're giving more money to the banks? How come you're this? How come you're that? How come you are persisting? How come you are preserving the banking system that has imposed terminal dispossession upon the world? How come you're an advocate of that? I want to know how and why. And unless you ask these people to expose themselves, all we can do is repeat our arguments over and over again. We're not acting in secret here. We're not planning a conspiracy. We're not planning to overthrow government. We're planning on reestablishing rightful government because we have no other alternative. We're about eradicating corruption from government, which is the only thing that's going to eradicate banking. So that's why mathematically perfected economy and absolute consensual representation are inseparable objects. There is nothing else that's going to save us, and as long as we continue to divide ourselves as we are, then we are our own worst enemies, and there is no hope for us. Thanks again for listening. I'm Mike Montagne, and we are all related.